The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon hung in the air, the soft hum of holiday music blending with the murmur of conversations. Yet, amidst the twinkling lights and festive cheer, there was an undeniable tension, a pressure that came from the demands of a Christmas Eve dinner rush. Sophia wiped her brow as she hurried through the busy restaurant, balancing a tray of drinks and plates, weaving between tables laden with laughter and merriment. She'd been on her feet all day, but the warmth of the season didn't seem to reach her. This wasn't just another night. It was the one night she hoped everything would go smoothly. It wasn't just about the tips or the extra hours. It was about trying to hold it all together for her family. Across the room, the dim light reflected off polished silverware as a group of well-dressed men sat at a VIP table, their conversations drowning out the noise around them. Among them, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in an immaculate suit, sat back, fingers lightly tapping on his wine glass. His sharp eyes swept over the restaurant, clearly not impressed by the festive decorations or the effort the staff put into making the night memorable. He was here for one reason: business. His name was Christopher Hale, a millionaire businessman who had more than enough money to buy anything in the world, but never quite understood the value of hard work, or the struggles of those who didn't share his fortune. He raised his glass, toasting to nothing in particular, the clinking sound almost drowned by the cacophony of the holiday crowd. Across the room, Sophia moved with purpose, her every step calculated, trying to balance her responsibilities as she delivered orders with a polite smile. But tonight, that smile didn't come easily. The weight of everything she'd been through in the last few months was starting to show. As she passed by the table where Christopher sat, a tray tipped slightly to the side. The glasses wobbled dangerously. She adjusted her grip, but it was too late. The tray slid, and before she could steady it, a glass of water splashed onto Christopher's suit. A perfect storm in an otherwise perfect evening. The room fell silent for a split second, all eyes turning toward the table. Sophia's face flushed a deep shade of red, and she immediately apologized. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" Christopher's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a displeased sneer. He didn't speak at first, but his cold gaze said enough. "Watch where you're going next time, will you?" he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. Sophia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the judgment of the room, the way her mistake had been magnified. The weight of the night seemed to come crashing down on her all at once, but as the tension stretched, something inside her held firm. "I truly apologize, sir. I'll have it cleaned up right away," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions threatening to break free. Christopher didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he glanced at his colleagues, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered, as if the very idea of a waitress making a mistake was something beyond comprehension. Sophia quickly moved to clear the table, her mind racing, trying to focus on the next task. But as she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, a strange thought crossed her mind. There's more to this man than meets the eye. Are you curious about how this story unfolds? Make sure to watch till the end. You won't want to miss the twist. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on this story. Just as the thought passed, Sophia's hand froze mid-step. She had a strange feeling that their lives were connected in ways neither of them could yet understand. Her father had always said, "The past has a funny way of catching up with you." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she approached Christopher's table, the weight of the tray pressing against her arm. She'd been managing fine all night, keeping the rhythm steady, avoiding mishaps, but now, this was different. This was his table. She took a deep breath, glancing at the order slips in her pocket, scanning the room for any other issues that needed her attention. A couple in the corner booth was discussing wedding plans, and a family near the bar was waiting for dessert. But for now, everything was in order. Sophia tried to focus, not allowing herself to dwell on the interaction earlier. The moment of embarrassment had passed, right? Yet, as she approached Christopher's table, her stomach tightened. She could already feel the weight of his gaze, his unspoken judgment lingering in the air. Even now, when she was only a few steps away, his cold demeanor seemed to reach out and latch onto her. The sharpness in his eyes as they flickered up to meet hers made her stomach churn. Christopher was talking animatedly with his colleagues, not paying much attention to her at first. That was fine with her. She didn't want to draw any more attention to herself than necessary. But as she neared the table, her foot caught on the edge of the carpet, just enough to throw off her balance. The tray in her hand tipped slightly. Before she could even make a proper adjustment, the glass of water on the tray slid, its contents spilling out. The next moment, the cold water splashed across Christopher's crisp, expensive suit. The sound of liquid hitting fabric was louder than expected. It rang in her ears like an echo, stretching the moment into something far too long. For a second, everything seemed to stop. The hum of the restaurant, the distant chatter, the clinking of silverware, all of it faded as Sophia froze, wide-eyed, staring at the water soaking into the fabric of his suit. A deep silence settled over the table. His colleagues paused, some of them glancing at the scene, while others stared at Christopher, unsure of what to do next. Sophia's face turned bright red, the shame flooding her chest. She could feel all eyes on her, but it was his stare that felt the most piercing. He slowly raised his gaze, looking at her with an expression that seemed colder than the December night outside. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Sophia thought she saw something like disbelief in them. His mouth opened as if to say something, and Sophia braced herself. He stood up, his movements sharp, controlled. His eyes never left hers, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. He was already adjusting his jacket, brushing off the small remnants of water. The fact that the suit was hardly affected didn't seem to matter to him. It was the principle of it. "Well, that was just perfect," he said, his voice laced with disdain. The words were slow, deliberate, and each one felt like a slap across her face. He didn't shout, but his tone carried weight, an unmistakable superiority. He glanced at his colleagues, who were all watching, waiting for his reaction. "It's Christmas Eve and I'm being served by a clumsy waitress who can't even carry a tray properly. I suppose this is the kind of service I should expect, huh?" Sophia stood frozen, trying to swallow the lump that had formed in her throat. Her instinct screamed at her to apologize, to beg him to understand it was a mistake, but the pride in her wouldn't let her. This wasn't about the accident anymore. It was about how he was treating her. Her fingers tightened around the tray, her grip steadying despite her racing heart. "I didn't mean to spill the water, sir," she said, her voice calm, though it trembled at the edges. She refused to back down. Christopher's gaze sharpened as he looked at her. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," he said, sarcasm dripping from his words. "But maybe you should think about how much you cost me with your carelessness. I've worked hard to get to where I am. What's your excuse?" Sophia's heart sank, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to apologize for something that wasn't her fault. "I'm just trying to do my job, sir," she replied, her words measured, though her stomach churned. "If you'll allow me, I'll clean it up right away." He glanced at her, still standing, then slowly shook his head. No need for that," he said, his voice louder now. "It's already ruined. You've ruined my entire evening." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes flickering over to his colleagues, who were watching the exchange in tense silence. "Look at you," he continued, his voice growing more biting with every word. "Just a waitress. What else could you possibly do? You'll be stuck here forever, won't you? It's not surprising, really. Some people are born to serve, and that's all they'll ever be good for." Sophia flinched at the harshness in his words, the sting of his cruelty sharp against her self-worth. But deep inside, there was something else, a steady resolve she didn't even know she had. She had faced worse in her life than this, worse than being insulted by someone who didn't know a thing about her. She could have walked away. She could have apologized again, begged for forgiveness. But instead, she stood tall. The weight of the trays in her hands had been replaced with the weight of her pride, and she wasn't about to let him tear it down so easily. "I've had enough," she said, the words escaping her lips before she could second-guess them. "You have no idea who I am or what I've been through. Just because I'm here, doing my job, doesn't mean I'm beneath you." Christopher's expression flickered for a moment, confusion clouding his features, but it didn't last long. He leaned forward again, shaking his head, as if to say this wasn't worth his time. He leaned back in his chair and without another word turned his attention back to his colleagues. "I guess Christmas doesn't bring out the best in everyone," he muttered. Sophia stood there for a moment, the sting of his words still hanging in the air. She couldn't stop herself from glancing over at the table, where he and his colleagues were resuming their conversation, but she forced herself to look away. A soft breath left her lips as she moved toward the back of the restaurant, her heart still racing. The humiliation, the unfairness of it all, it burned. But beneath it, something else had ignited, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The words he'd thrown at her, his assumptions, his judgments, didn't define her. Not anymore. As the sound of Christopher's cutting remarks faded into the background, Sophia stood still for a moment longer. The quiet hum of the restaurant filled her ears, but it was muffled, almost distant. She could feel the heat of his words lingering in the air, but she was no longer allowing them to touch her. Instead, she breathed deeply, her fingers still clutching the tray, as though it was the only thing anchoring her to the present moment. The hum of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of the Christmas crowd, everything felt far away now. Sophia had been through worse, much worse. This wasn't the first time someone had looked down on her or made assumptions about her life and her worth. It wasn't the first time someone's cruel words had tried to chip away at her sense of self. But tonight was different. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about something deeper. She knew something about Christopher, something he didn't know about himself. Without rushing to respond, she let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing her words to settle, as though they were gaining weight before they even left her lips. "Maybe you don't know what you're dealing with," Sophia said calmly, her voice soft but steady. She didn't look directly at him, but she felt his eyes on her cold and piercing, as if he were waiting for her to break. But she didn't. She stood her ground. "What are you talking about?" Christopher scoffed, the edge of his voice betraying his curiosity, though he tried to mask it with an air of disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, still clearly irritated, but his attention had shifted. "You mean to tell me you've got some big secret to share? Some sob story about why you spilled my water? Because, honestly, I don't think I'm interested in hearing it." Sophia let out a breath, keeping her composure. She wasn't about to apologize for her words. This wasn't about the glass of water anymore. It was about something far more significant. "No," she replied, her tone unwavering. It's not a sob story, but it's something you wouldn't understand. Your father and mine, they had a history, something that goes beyond this restaurant and beyond the people you think you know. Christopher raised an eyebrow, his disbelief evident. My father? What does my father have to do with any of this? You're telling me this is some sort of family drama? Sophia's lips tightened into a thin line, and she met his gaze, her voice lowering slightly as she spoke. Your father was close with mine once. They knew each other, maybe more than you think. For a brief moment, Christopher's expression faltered. He looked at her as though he was trying to piece together a puzzle, but the pieces didn't fit. His mind raced with confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed this would be just another typical encounter with an employee, a careless mistake, a little humiliation, and then they'd both move on with their lives. But now, her words were rattling him, leaving him uncertain, questioning things he had never thought about. What are you saying? Christopher asked, his voice suddenly quieter, tinged with skepticism. Are you trying to tell me that you and we have some kind of connection, that our fathers were friends? Is that what this is about? Sophia's gaze softened for a brief second before hardening again, her words carrying a weight they hadn't before. Maybe not friends, but they shared something, a history, a legacy that's tied to both of us, whether you want to admit it or not. Christopher blinked, his disbelief growing. This is ridiculous. You think I'm supposed to care about some vague connection between our fathers? What does that even mean? You think that just because they knew each other, that somehow makes this okay? That this moment, this mistake, has some deeper meaning? Sophia shook her head, taking a small step back, feeling the weight of her words settle into the space between them. It's not about this moment. It's about everything that led us here. You can dismiss it all you want, but your father's choices shaped your life, and mine shaped mine. She paused, her eyes searching his face, trying to gauge whether he was even beginning to understand. Christopher's brow furrowed as he leaned forward, his arms uncrossed now, but his posture still rigid. I don't get it. I don't get you. What are you trying to say? Sophia exhaled slowly, her eyes briefly drifting toward the back of the restaurant, as if searching for the right words. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to think. You've lived your life with one set of rules. I've lived mine with another. We've both been shaped by the choices our fathers made, but we're not so different. There was a long pause as Christopher processed her words, though it was clear he still wasn't sure what to make of them. Sophia could see the wheels turning in his mind, but they weren't turning fast enough to catch up with the gravity of what she had said. He couldn't see past the surface, couldn't understand that the truth she was hinting at went much deeper than the trivial interactions of the night. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. This is ridiculous, he muttered, almost to himself. I don't have time for your emotional Christmas sentimentality. It's just water on a suit. You're reading too much into this. You probably just need a good tip, and to move on. Sophia held his gaze, her expression unwavering, though the corner of her mouth twitched slightly, as if to say, you have no idea. She could feel her chest tighten with the weight of all the unspoken history she carried. The history that wasn't just hers, but his too, whether he realized it or not. This isn't about a tip, she said quietly, a touch of bitterness in her voice. It's about knowing your place in the world, and about realizing that people like me, people like you, we're all shaped by the past, even if we don't want to admit it. Christopher looked away, his face flushed with annoyance, but there was a flicker of something else, a momentary uncertainty. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to entertain it. It was Christmas, after all, and he was supposed to be enjoying his evening. But her words stuck to him, like stubborn pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure how to fit together. As he glanced back at her, he forced a half smile, more out of politeness than anything else. Well, it was a nice try. But, honestly, I'm not interested in whatever cryptic message you're trying to send. I came here to enjoy my dinner, not to listen to you lecture me on family history. Sophia didn't flinch, didn't back down. You don't have to listen, but you might want to think twice before dismissing everything I've said. Because it's not just a mistake, Christopher. It's a reminder of what's coming. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him staring after her, his mind still trying to piece together the puzzle she'd left behind. The night dragged on for Christopher, but the festive cheer of the restaurant had lost its luster. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations. It all seemed distant, muffled, like the scene in a play he no longer cared to be a part of. As he gathered his coat, preparing to leave, his mind kept circling back to Sophia and the strange words she had said. For a moment, he wondered if he had overreacted. He didn't like to admit that, of course. But there it was. Her calmness, her poise in the face of his anger, had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She wasn't like the other waitstaff he encountered. Apathetic, eager to please, trying to brush off any insult in the hope of a bigger tip. Sophia had stood her ground. She hadn't crumbled beneath his mockery or cowered when he'd belittled her. Instead, she had dropped hints, cryptic little comments about their fathers and some kind of shared history that didn't make sense to him. He shook his head as he pulled on his coat, trying to brush off the strange feeling in his chest. Sophia was just a waitress, right? Just a woman working a holiday shift, no different from the thousands of others in the city. Yet something in the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, told him there was more to her than met the eye. He had dismissed her words at the time. Something about their father's past, some long-forgotten history. It didn't matter. He had never needed to worry about the past. His father had built his fortune, and he had made his own place in the world. What could the past possibly have to do with him now? But as he reached the door, he felt something small pressed into the inside of his coat pocket. For a second, he didn't know what it was, too wrapped up in his thoughts, his mind still churning over the odd encounter. But then, curiosity got the better of him. He slipped his hand into the pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. A letter. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting that covered the page. It wasn't long, but it was enough to leave him with more questions than answers. Dear Christopher, I know that you likely don't believe anything I said tonight, but I ask that you keep an open mind. My father and yours once had a bond, a friendship, that was strong enough to build something bigger than either of them. They were business partners, once. It was a partnership that changed everything. But something happened. There was a betrayal, a break in that bond that tore them apart and created a division that still lingers to this day. I don't know the full details, and neither do you, but my father spoke of it often before he passed. I think it's time for you to know the truth, if you're willing to listen. You don't have to believe me, but I hope you will take this seriously. The past has a way of catching up with us, no matter how much we try to leave it behind. Sophia Christopher stared at the letter for a long time, his mind reeling. His first instinct was to throw it away. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as just another oddity from a waitress who had said too much. He had enough on his plate, enough to deal with. Why should he waste his time trying to unravel some old, dusty family drama? But there was something about her words that gnawed at him, Something about the way she had spoken about their fathers, about a friendship, a bond, a betrayal. What was she getting at? He had heard bits and pieces of his father's past, of course. There were always whispers about the people who had helped him build his empire, and some of those people had long since disappeared from the picture. Some had drifted away, others had been cast aside, but there was never a clear story. He'd grown up with the understanding that his father had made the right choices, had surrounded himself with the right people, and had left behind anyone who didn't measure up. It had always been that simple to him. But now, as he held the letter in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder, what if there was more to it? What if there was something he didn't know, something that his father had never spoken of? Sighing, he slid into the back seat of the car, the weight of the letter still heavy in his hand. As the car started to move, the city lights passed by in a blur, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting back to that restaurant, to Sophia's calm expression, to her words that had unsettled him. He could almost hear her voice in his head, echoing the cryptic things she had said about the past. He looked at the letter again, rereading it slowly, as though the words might suddenly reveal something he had missed the first time. But they didn't. They just hung there, like a riddle with no answer, waiting for him to make sense of it all. The truth was, he didn't know where to begin. What was this betrayal she spoke of? Who had wronged whom? And how did it all tie back to him? He had always believed that his father had built everything on his own, that every success, every deal, every business venture was the result of hard work and the ability to outsmart his competitors. But now, looking at this letter, he wasn't so sure. Maybe there was a history that had shaped his father's choices, a history that had been hidden, left unspoken. Maybe his father hadn't been the untouchable figure he'd always seemed to be. Christopher closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a sense of unease settle over him. This was more than just a random coincidence. Sophia had known something. She had seen something in him, in his past, that he hadn't seen before. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything there was to know about his life and his future. But now, with this letter in his hands, he felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. What had he missed? What had been left unsaid? As the car sped down the dark streets, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was the beginning of something far bigger than he was ready for. The answers were out there. He just had to find them, and somehow he knew that finding them wouldn't be as easy as he thought. The night was still and quiet when Christopher set the letter down, its weight lingering in his hands. His thoughts raced with questions, each one more pressing than the last. What did it all mean? How was he supposed to process the idea that his father, the man who had built the empire Christopher now inherited, might have had a hand in ruining someone else's life? The next morning, despite the Christmas festivities still holding the city in its grasp, Christopher felt a shift inside himself. The world outside his office window looked the same. People hurrying through streets lined with holiday lights, shopping bags in hand, rushing to prepare for the festivities. But to him, it all felt distant. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the sense that something vital was slipping through his fingers. He had to know more. With his thoughts scattered and unsettled, Christopher spent the morning in his office, but it wasn't the usual business meetings or calls that filled his day. Instead, he found himself poring over the family archives, the dusty boxes in the attic, the old leather-bound albums that hadn't been touched in years, his father's collection of memorabilia. For years, it had simply been a symbol of the past, a space filled with trivial items he had never once given a second thought. But now, the idea that it held pieces of his own history, of the history he'd never bothered to question, made his stomach twist. The hours seemed to pass in a blur, the sun dimming outside his window as he sifted through stacks of old letters, business contracts, and faded photographs. The deeper he went, the more he felt as though he were uncovering a foreign world, a world his father had never wanted him to see. Then, amidst the stacks of papers, he found something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A series of letters between his father and a man he didn't recognize, but whose name struck a chord: Ethan Montgomery. The name was familiar. It was Sophia's last name, and the connection hit him like a bolt of lightning. Ethan Montgomery. Sophia's father. Christopher flipped through the letters quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The correspondence wasn't about casual pleasantries. No, these were business letters, discussing deals, contracts, and investments. What caught Christopher's eye was the tone, respectful, even friendly in the beginning. His father, always so guarded with his emotions, had spoken highly of Ethan. They had been partners, it seemed, colleagues in business, two men who had once trusted each other. The letters spoke of joint ventures and plans to expand their business, projects that seemed destined for success. As Christopher read further, the tone began to shift. There was an increasing tension in the exchanges, disagreements, and signs of distrust creeping in. The final letter was terse, abrupt, and cold. In the letter, Christopher's father had written, "Ethan, I'm afraid I must part ways with you on this venture. My decision is final. There's no room for discussion. The risks are too high, and your vision is no longer aligned with mine. I'll be proceeding with a different partner." Christopher felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment. This was the decision that had torn apart everything. He continued reading, each word heavier than the last. Ethan's response came weeks later, a single letter that spoke volumes without saying much at all. "I hope your success brings you everything you desire. But don't forget, Christopher, some things are built on trust, and when that trust is broken, it can never be repaired." The bitterness in those words was unmistakable. As Christopher read them, a cold realization swept over him. His father had not just ended a business partnership. He had betrayed Ethan Montgomery. He had taken advantage of Ethan's trust and left him with nothing. The decision, driven by greed or self-preservation, had ruined the Montgomery family, leaving them with shattered dreams and broken financial stability. Christopher sat back in his chair, staring at the letters. He was shocked. This wasn't just about business. This wasn't just about profits and losses. This was personal. His father had ruined Sophia's father's life. And in doing so, he had helped build the wealth that Christopher now enjoyed. The irony was suffocating. The luxury he lived in, the ease of his daily life, had been built on the suffering of someone else. Someone who had once been a trusted partner, a friend. He couldn't believe it. The man he had always looked up to, the man who had built everything Christopher had inherited, had made choices that were selfish, ruthless, and damaging. Christopher's hands shook as he put the letters down. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. The past was not just a collection of family stories. It was a shadow that stretched out and touched everything. Every success. Every mistake. His father had betrayed someone he cared about, and now, decades later, that betrayal was coming back to haunt him. But it wasn't just about the past anymore. What troubled Christopher more than anything was the realization that his actions, his choices, were tied to this betrayal. The money, the power, the status, it all felt tainted. He wasn't just the son of a successful businessman. He was the inheritor of a broken legacy, one that had come at the expense of others. As the weight of the discovery settled over him, Christopher felt a wave of shame wash over him. All his life, he had been proud of the empire his father had built, proud of the life he had created for himself. But now, he couldn't shake the image of Sophia, her quiet strength, her resilience. She had been carrying the weight of this story all these years, and he had never known. He had never even bothered to ask. But now, the story was his to face. It wasn't just about Sophia's family anymore, it was about him too. The betrayal wasn't just something that had happened in the past. It was something that was alive, and it had brought him to this point. The question now was what he would do with this knowledge. What would he do now that he knew the truth? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as Christopher sat alone in his office, surrounded by the remnants of the past, one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The past had caught up with him, and it was time to confront it. The days that followed were a blur of discovery for Christopher. The more he uncovered, the more he realized just how little he truly knew about his father's past. The documents he had found only deepened the mystery, revealing more than just a business betrayal. It was a network of deceit, greed, and manipulation, a web that stretched far beyond what he had ever imagined. Sophia's father, Ethan Montgomery, had been a rising star in the business world. He had been an ambitious, sharp-minded entrepreneur, full of potential. Christopher had heard stories from his father about the early days of their partnership, about how they had worked side by side to build their business empires. But what Christopher had never known, what his father had conveniently left out, was the darker side of that partnership, the side that involved betrayal and manipulation. Ethan had been a talented businessman, no doubt about it. But what Christopher had learned from the old letters was that Ethan had trusted his partner, his best friend, his brother-in-arms, too much. And that trust, as it turned out, had been misplaced. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about personal loyalty. The kind of loyalty that one man could never repay once it had been broken. His father had used Ethan's trust to his advantage, pushing him out of the picture just as their business was about to hit its peak. Christopher couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he read through the accounts of how his father had outmaneuvered Ethan, convincing him that the company's direction was taking a turn that Ethan couldn't follow. The reality was far darker. His father had known exactly what he was doing. He had been using Caldwell, a third-party figure in the background, to manipulate the entire situation. Caldwell. The name kept resurfacing in the documents, and it wasn't long before Christopher understood why. Caldwell was no stranger to the business world. He was a man whose name carried weight, but not in the way one would want. Caldwell was the kind of person who thrived in the shadows, exploiting the trust of others for his own gain. He was a corrupt businessman, a man whose morals had long been compromised by the allure of power and money. It wasn't just that Caldwell had played both sides against each other. He had orchestrated the whole thing, playing a long game with masterful precision. It turned out that Caldwell had been a key player in the downfall of both families. His plan had been simple: create a rift between the two men who had once been inseparable. He had seen an opportunity in their partnership and had taken advantage of it. Caldwell had offered his assistance to both Ethan and Christopher's father, making promises of success and fortune. But in reality, he had been playing them against each other from the very beginning, pulling strings behind the scenes, fostering distrust and animosity between the two men who had once trusted each other completely. As Christopher continued to read, the pieces began to fall into place. His father had been just one part of the equation. Caldwell had been the real mastermind, the one who had stood to gain the most from the fallout between Ethan and Christopher's father. By manipulating their trust, Caldwell had positioned himself at the center of everything, a silent player in the background, pulling the strings while both families had suffered. Sophia's father, Ethan, had lost everything. The business he had built from the ground up had crumbled under the weight of betrayal and manipulation. And when that happened, the Montgomery family had been left with nothing. What hurt Christopher the most was realizing that this wasn't just business. It was personal. Caldwell had exploited both families, but it had been his father who had made the final decision, the one that ultimately shattered their future. For days, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a world he had never known. The glossy veneer of his wealth, the success of his empire, it all felt hollow now. He had been raised in luxury, but that luxury had been bought at the cost of someone else's pain. The money he had taken for granted, the fortune he had inherited, had been built on the backs of people like Ethan Montgomery, whose dreams had been crushed. And now, through Sophia, he had come face to face with the human cost of that wealth. He sat in his office, the documents scattered across his desk, as he processed everything he had learned. It wasn't just a betrayal of business, it was a betrayal of trust, friendship, and loyalty. Caldwell had manipulated both families for his own personal gain. But his father's role in that manipulation, in exploiting someone who had once been like family, was something Christopher couldn't easily forgive. Sophia had been right. The past wasn't just about distant memories. It wasn't just about cold business deals and forgotten alliances. The past had a way of resurfacing, dragging up the ugliness that had been buried under the weight of time. Sophia's quiet strength, her ability to stand firm despite the humiliation he had caused her, had been a stark contrast to the selfishness he had once admired in his father. Now, he was left with the uncomfortable truth that he had been the beneficiary of a legacy built on lies, betrayal, and broken friendships. But beyond the betrayal, something else had begun to stir inside Christopher, a sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about undoing the wrongs of the past. It was about finding a way to make things right, not just for himself, but for Sophia and her family as well. He had inherited his father's wealth, but it was clear now that wealth alone couldn't offer redemption. It wouldn't erase the pain or the damage that had been done. The only way forward, the only way to break the cycle of manipulation and deceit, was to confront the past and take action. Sophia's father, Ethan Montgomery, had been a man of integrity, someone who had trusted the wrong person and paid the price for it. And now it was up to Christopher to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Would he continue to live in the shadow of his father's decisions, or would he take a stand and rewrite his own story? The discovery of Caldwell's involvement in the downfall of both families had opened Christopher's eyes. It had shown him that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The world he had been living in, the world of power and wealth, was built on fragile foundations. It could all come crashing down with one wrong move, one misplaced trust. And Caldwell, the man who had orchestrated it all, was still out there, lurking in the background, ready to strike again. Sophia's father's legacy was more than just a tale of betrayal. It was a story of what happens when people let greed and ambition cloud their judgment. It was a reminder that no matter how high you climb, the ground you stand on can be pulled out from under you in an instant. Christopher knew he couldn't change the past, but he could try to prevent history from repeating itself. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the weight of his newfound knowledge pressed down on him, Christopher felt a resolve begin to build inside him. The connections between their families were deeper than he had realized, and the consequences of his father's actions were far-reaching. But that didn't mean all was lost. There was still time to make things right. and for the first time in a long time, Christopher believed that he might actually be able to do something meaningful with his life. Not just for himself, but for the people who had been wronged along the way. Christopher felt a tight knot in his stomach as he approached the small, cozy cafe where he had arranged to meet Sophia. He had never been one to feel remorse, especially not over something as trivial as an outburst. But this was different. This wasn't a mistake in a business deal or a miscalculated investment. It was personal. He had wronged someone who, despite everything, had shown him kindness. And now, the weight of his family's past actions had become something he could no longer ignore. The cafe was warm, the air filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of other patrons engaged in quiet conversations. He spotted Sophia at a corner table, her back straight, her eyes focused on a cup of tea in front of her. She looked composed, as if nothing had happened. But Christopher knew better. The way she had stood up to him at the restaurant, the calm in her voice despite his mockery. It all pointed to a deeper well of strength and resilience. He walked over to her table, hesitating for a moment, before taking a seat across from her. She looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. There was no warm greeting, no acknowledgement of their past encounter. Instead, there was just silence, a quiet tension that hung between them like an unspoken agreement. "I know you're probably wondering why I asked to meet," Christopher began, his voice soft but steady. "I owe you an apology. For what happened at the restaurant, He paused, searching for the right words, the ones that would make up for the way he had treated her. "I was arrogant and rude. I had no right to speak to you like that. It was wrong of me." Sophia didn't immediately respond. She simply regarded him with a calm, steady gaze, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her teacup. The silence stretched on, but Christopher could tell she was considering his words, weighing their sincerity. Finally, she spoke, her voice cool but not unkind. "You're right. You were arrogant. You thought you could dismiss me because of the job I do and the life I lead. You didn't care to see the person behind the uniform." She met his gaze then, and for the first time, Christopher saw a hint of the hurt that had been buried beneath her composed exterior. "But I understand why you acted that way. People like you, people with power, don't usually have to think about the people they step on to get to the top." Christopher flinched, the truth of her words cutting deeper than he expected. It wasn't just that he had been rude to her, it was the realization that, until now, he had lived a life where his privilege had shielded him from seeing the struggles of others. He had always seen his wealth as something earned, something deserved. But now, with everything he had learned about his father's past, the facade of his comfortable life was beginning to crumble. "I didn't know," Christopher murmured. "I didn't know what my father had done. I didn't know about Caldwell, or about how your family suffered because of him." He paused, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I always thought I had worked hard for everything I have, that it was all my own doing. But now, I see how much of it was built on the backs of people like your father, people who trusted the wrong people." Sophia leaned back in her chair, her expression guarded but not entirely distant. "It wasn't just your father, Christopher. It was Caldwell too. But your father's betrayal, the way he turned on mine, the way he took everything that was ours, it was personal. Caldwell didn't do this to us because of some grand business strategy. He did it because he saw an opportunity to profit from my father's trust. And your father, well, he didn't hesitate to take advantage of it." Christopher's chest tightened as he listened to her recount the events. He had always heard bits and pieces of stories about his father's business dealings, stories that were often embellished or downplayed. but he had never known the full extent of the betrayal. And hearing it now, from Sophia herself, made it all the more real. Her pain wasn't just about the money that was lost. It was about the trust that had been shattered, the years of hardship her family had endured because of his father's actions. "I can't imagine what it must have been like for you," Christopher said quietly. "To watch everything your father built be taken away, to have your family's legacy torn apart by someone you trusted." He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his guilt pressing heavily on his shoulders. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now. I understand the pain my father caused." Sophia's eyes softened, but there was no sign of immediate forgiveness. She had suffered too much to offer that so easily. Instead, she nodded slowly, acknowledging his words, but also setting her own boundaries. "Understanding is a start," she said. "But it's just that. A start. The truth is, Christopher, my father's legacy was destroyed. He was never given a chance to rebuild what he lost. And while I've tried to make a life for myself, to move forward with the lessons he taught me, it's hard. Harder than anyone could imagine." There was a long pause before Sophia spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I've worked hard to get where I am. I've built my own life from the ground up, without any help from anyone. And maybe that's why I can't just forgive and forget. It's not about you, not really. It's about what your father took from us, and what you can do now, with the knowledge you have." Christopher's heart raced as he absorbed her words. For the first time, he realized that his privilege wasn't just about money. It was about opportunity, about doors that were always open to him, about choices that had always been available. But Sophia's life had been different. She had fought for everything she had, often with nothing but sheer determination to guide her. And now, he was faced with the truth of how his family's actions had made her fight even harder. "I don't know what I can do," Christopher admitted, feeling vulnerable for the first time in a long while. "But I want to try. I want to make it right, Sophia. I don't want to live with the consequences of my father's choices anymore." Sophia studied him for a long moment, the weight of her own pain evident in her eyes. Finally, she sighed, a long, weary exhale that seemed to release some of the tension between them. "I don't know what that means yet," she said softly. "But we'll see. We'll see if you can really change. We'll see if you can actually take responsibility for what your father did." As the conversation lingered, the air between them felt less heavy, though the path forward was still unclear. But for the first time, Christopher felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced before, the possibility of redemption. The discovery of the past had been a shock to Christopher, but the more he and Sophia dug into the history of their families, the more unsettling truths they unearthed. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted them. It was the presence of a shadow that still loomed over their lives, a figure that had orchestrated much of the suffering and pain they now had to face. Caldwell. Caldwell wasn't just some distant memory from their father's pasts. He was still very much alive, still very much in control of the power that had once caused so much destruction. And now, as Christopher and Sophia spent more time together, piecing together the fragments of their father's shared history, it became clear that Caldwell's influence was far from diminished. His corrupt practices hadn't just faded into obscurity, they had evolved, growing more sinister with time. Sophia had mentioned Caldwell often in their conversations, but each time she spoke of him, there was an edge to her words, a mix of fear, anger, and distrust. She'd made it clear that Caldwell was not the kind of man to let anyone expose his wrongdoings without consequences. But now, as they stood together, facing the stark reality of his continued power, Christopher couldn't ignore the truth any longer. If they wanted to truly put an end to the legacy of betrayal, they would have to confront Caldwell head-on. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Christopher found himself pacing in the quiet of his apartment. He couldn't sit still. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on him like an invisible burden. He had come to realize, in the hours of reflection after his conversation with Sophia, that his own guilt was not enough to fix everything. He couldn't just apologize to her and expect things to change. To make amends for what his father had done, he had to take action. When he called Sophia to propose the idea of confronting Caldwell, she didn't hesitate. Her voice, though calm, betrayed a hint of resolve. "We can't keep running from this," she said, her words firm. "If we don't do something now, Caldwell will continue to manipulate everyone he touches. He's already ruined lives, including mine. It's time we put an end to it." Sophia's determination was evident, and for the first time, Christopher realized that they were no longer just two people bound by shared history. They were allies, partners in something far bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming control of their futures, about breaking free from the chains of their father's mistakes. The next few days were spent in careful preparation. They gathered evidence, piecing together everything they had discovered about Caldwell's past dealings, his web of corruption that stretched far beyond what either of them had imagined. Christopher knew it wouldn't be easy. Caldwell was a powerful man, and his reach was vast. But they couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. They arranged to meet Caldwell at his office, an imposing glass-walled skyscraper in the heart of the city. The building itself seemed to echo Caldwell's personality. Sleek, cold, and untouchable. As they approached the entrance, Christopher could feel the nerves in his stomach twist into a knot. This was it. There would be no turning back after today. Sophia walked beside him, her face a mask of calm determination. She had come a long way from the woman he had first met, the timid waitress who had once stood alone, fighting against the weight of her past. Now she stood beside him, a force to be reckoned with. They were escorted into Caldwell's office, a room that exuded wealth and power in every corner. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, the furniture luxurious and polished. Caldwell himself stood by the window, his back to them, looking out over the city below. He turned slowly as they entered, a smile playing on his lips, though his eyes were cold. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and calculating. "I didn't expect to see the two of you together. What's this about? Some sort of reunion?" Sophia's gaze never wavered. "This isn't a reunion, Caldwell. This is a reckoning." Christopher stepped forward, his heart pounding. "We know what you did. We know about the deal with our fathers, about how you used them both to get what you wanted, and we know how you've continued to manipulate everything behind the scenes, including our families." Caldwell's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was quickly replaced with a chuckle. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of something without consequences? You don't know who you're dealing with." His voice grew darker, more menacing. "I've built this empire from the ground up, and I don't take kindly to people who try to destroy it. You think you can stop me?" Sophia stepped forward, her voice steady but fierce. "You've already destroyed enough lives, Caldwell. Our father's mistakes don't belong to us, but we're the ones who've had to live with them. We're the ones who've suffered because of you, and now we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Caldwell's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl. "You think you're in a position to threaten me? You're nothing. You've always been nothing. And if you think for 1 second that anyone will believe you over me, you're gravely mistaken." Christopher could feel the tension rising in the room, the air thick with danger. He knew that they were walking a fine line. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. But despite the fear, there was also a growing sense of clarity. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the truth, for the people who had been silenced by Caldwell's corruption. "We don't need anyone's approval, Caldwell," Christopher said, his voice more forceful now. "We have the truth on our side, and we'll make sure everyone hears it. You've hurt enough people, and you're not going to get away with it anymore." For a moment, there was silence. Caldwell's expression shifted, the veneer of confidence cracking. He took a step toward them, his face contorted in rage. "You're making a grave mistake," he hissed. "This will cost you both more than you realize." Sophia didn't flinch. "We've already paid the price. But we're done being afraid." The confrontation had reached its boiling point. Caldwell's threats were empty, but the danger was far from over. Still, for the first time in their lives, both Christopher and Sophia felt a sense of empowerment that transcended the fear. They weren't just facing a corrupt businessman anymore. They were facing the shadows of the past, and they were ready to break free. Together. The weight of the confrontation with Caldwell lingered long after they left his office. Though they had faced the corrupt businessman head-on, the battle was far from over. Caldwell's threats had been intense, his anger palpable, but the truth was on their side. And that truth had begun to settle heavily in Christopher's mind. He couldn't simply walk away from everything he had discovered, everything he had learned about his father's actions, and the devastating effects it had had on Sophia's family. No, there was something more that needed to be done. Christopher knew it wasn't enough to expose Caldwell and let the world know the depth of his corruption. That was just the beginning. The real work, the hard part, was finding a way to make amends. He had to do more than just apologize to Sophia. He had to use the resources at his disposal to right the wrongs that had been done. It was late one evening when the thought first crossed his mind. He was sitting at his desk, looking through the papers that had revealed the dark truth about his father's betrayal, when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Sophia. "Christopher," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I've been thinking. About everything. What's next? What happens now?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy with expectation. Christopher took a deep breath before answering, the weight of his decision settling in his chest. "I've been thinking the same thing," he replied. "I want to help you. I want to do more than just apologize. I know it's not enough, but I want to restore what was lost. Your father's business, it wasn't just a business. It was his legacy, and I want to help rebuild it." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Christopher thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You don't have to do this," Sophia said. "I've worked hard to build a life for myself. I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," Christopher answered quickly. "It's an opportunity to fix what's broken. I have the resources, the means, and I'm not asking for anything in return. This isn't about me. It's about making things right." Sophia was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice still cautious, but no longer as distant. "Okay, but this has to be on our terms, Christopher. I don't want this to be something you do because you feel guilty. I want this to be something we do together. Something that honors my father's work, not just for the sake of fixing the past, but for the future." Her words struck a chord deep within him. This wasn't about undoing a mistake. It was about creating something new, something better. It was about building a future where their families, their lives, could be shaped by their own decisions, not by the ghosts of the past. And Christopher was ready to do whatever it took to make that future a reality. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, plans, and hard work. Christopher didn't waste any time. He called in favors, used his influence to gather investors, and made it clear to everyone that he was committed to seeing this project through. But it wasn't about securing a return on investment for him. It was about securing a future for Sophia and her family's legacy. He wanted to ensure that her father's hard work, his vision, and his values would be honored, no matter the cost. Sophia was hesitant at first, but as she saw the depth of Christopher's commitment, she began to trust him. She had always been skeptical of his wealth, his privilege, and the arrogance that had defined him for so long. But as he worked side by side with her, listening to her ideas and offering genuine support, she saw a side of him she never knew existed. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was someone who was willing to fight for what was right, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. Together, they created a new plan for the business, one that combined Sophia's father's vision with fresh, innovative ideas that would appeal to a new generation. They focused on sustainable practices, community outreach, and creating a brand that not only represented quality, but also integrity. It was hard work, but it was rewarding. And through it all, Christopher stood by Sophia, offering support without hesitation. His influence opened doors, but it was her drive, her dedication, and her heart that guided them forward. As the weeks turned into months, the changes they made began to take shape. The family business, once on the brink of collapse, started to regain its footing. They refurbished the old building, bringing it back to life with a modern touch that still honored its roots. They hired new employees, many of whom were from the local community, offering them fair wages and creating a workplace that was built on respect and trust. But it wasn't just the business that was changing. It was Christopher himself. For the first time in his life, he began to see the world through a different lens. His wealth no longer felt like an armor he could hide behind. It was a tool, a means to make a difference, to help others, to create real, lasting change. He spent more time with Sophia, not just as a business partner, but as a friend. They had long conversations about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and the lessons they had learned along the way. There were moments of vulnerability, moments of laughter, and moments of deep reflection. Christopher realized that the man he had been, the arrogant, entitled businessman, wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. He didn't need to rely on his wealth to feel powerful. He just needed to do what was right. One evening, as they sat together in the newly renovated office, Christopher looked over at Sophia, a sense of gratitude filling him. The business was flourishing, but more importantly, so was he. He had found a sense of purpose in helping her restore her father's legacy, and in doing so, he had restored something within himself. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I'm glad I am, and I'm grateful for you, Sophia, for giving me the chance to make things right." Sophia smiled, a hint of warmth in her eyes. "You didn't have to do any of this, Christopher, but you did, and that means more than you know." The journey they had been on was far from easy, but it had brought them to a place of redemption and restoration. They had faced the past, confronted their mistakes, and chosen to build a future based on honesty, humility, and a commitment to making the world better. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt that they were on the right path, together. Christmas morning dawned with a soft blanket of snow covering the town, the streets glowing under the early light of day. The air was crisp and clear, the kind of Christmas day that felt full of promise and renewal. It was a day for fresh starts, and for both Sophia and Christopher, it was a chance to embrace everything they had learned, everything they had overcome, and everything that lay ahead. The community event was being held in the town square, a tradition that brought together people from all walks of life. The event was a celebration of the season, of healing, forgiveness, and the true spirit of Christmas. Local families gathered around festive booths, children laughing and playing in the snow while music filled the air, adding a sense of warmth to the winter chill. This was the kind of celebration that reminded everyone what mattered most: community, love, and shared humanity. Sophia stood by the entrance to the square, looking around at the decorations, the smiles on the faces of the people around her. It was a far cry from the cold, isolated Christmases she had known in the past. Her heart, once heavy with the burden of years of struggle, now felt light. For the first time in a long time, she was truly at peace. Christopher stood beside her, his expression calm, almost reflective. He wasn't the same man who'd stormed into the restaurant months ago, arrogant and dismissive of everyone around him. No, today he was different, changed. The journey he had taken, the decisions he had made, had stripped away the layers of pride and privilege he had clung to for so long. The man standing beside Sophia was one who now understood the value of humility, the importance of kindness, and the power of second chances. Together, they walked through the square, greeted by familiar faces from the community. People who had once seen Christopher as nothing more than a wealthy outsider now looked at him with a newfound respect. He had proven himself in the hardest ways, not through money or influence, but through the way he had worked alongside Sophia to rebuild what had been broken. His efforts had not been in vain, and the trust he had earned from the people was something he would never take for granted. As they made their way to the centre of the square, a small stage had been set up, and a few local leaders stood at the front, ready to give speeches. The crowd quieted as the event began, the mood shifting from festive celebration to one of reflection. This was not just any Christmas gathering. It was a moment for everyone to acknowledge the healing that had taken place within the community. Sophia's eyes scanned the crowd, feeling a sense of awe at how far she had come. Her family's business was no longer just a shadow of what it once was. It had been rebuilt, and it was thriving. She had not done it alone, but she had done it with the strength of her own resilience and the support of people who truly cared. She had taken on a new role, stepping into her father's shoes with confidence and determination. She had learned from her past, but she had also made peace with it. Christopher, standing beside her, could see how much this moment meant to her. She had not only rebuilt her father's business, but had also reclaimed her own sense of self-worth. She was no longer the waitress who had been humiliated in the restaurant. She was the woman who had faced unimaginable challenges and had come out stronger for it. As the speeches concluded, the town leaders invited Sophia to the stage. She walked up, her steps steady and purposeful, and as she took the microphone, the crowd erupted into applause. "This is a moment I've been waiting for," she began, her voice strong yet filled with emotion. "Not just for my family, but for all of us. This business, this legacy, it's not just about money. It's about community, trust, and the strength we find in one another." Sophia paused, taking a breath as the weight of her words settled on the crowd. She had come a long way since that fateful night when she had been humiliated by Christopher. She had found not only her voice, but her purpose. And now, standing before the people who had supported her, she was ready to lead. "I want to thank each and every one of you for believing in me," she continued. "This isn't just about rebuilding a business. It's about rebuilding relationships. And I promise to carry my father's values forward with integrity, compassion, and respect for everyone who walks through our doors." The applause grew louder, and for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to truly embrace the moment. This was her victory, not just as a businesswoman, but as a person who had refused to give up. After the speech, the community event continued with laughter, food, and music. Children ran around, and families gathered together, sharing stories and creating new memories. Sophia and Christopher stayed close, enjoying the day, the spirit of the season, and the peace that had come from their hard work. As evening approached, the town square glowed with the warm light of Christmas trees and lanterns. The stars twinkled above, and for a brief moment, the world felt perfectly still, as if time itself was giving them a chance to reflect on all that had happened. Christopher looked over at Sophia, a sense of deep satisfaction filling him. "You've come so far," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I'm proud of you." Sophia smiled, her eyes soft with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Christopher. But I've learned that it's not about doing it alone. It's about doing it together. That's the real gift of Christmas." For both of them, the holiday season had come to represent something far greater than presents or celebrations. It was about redemption, forgiveness, and new beginnings. They had both found the strength to face their pasts, confront their mistakes, and rebuild their lives. And now, as the snow fell gently around them, they knew that this Christmas was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, growth, and the promise of a brighter future. As the night wore on, they joined the rest of the community, celebrating not only the season, but the transformation they had both undergone. They had found redemption, not in the wealth they had once relied on, but in the people they had helped, the bonds they had formed, and the second chances they had given each other. And as the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of a new year, both Christopher and Sophia knew that the journey they had started was only just beginning. The lessons of the past had shaped them, but the future was theirs to create, together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring content like this. Your support means the world to us. If you want to show extra love and appreciation, you can use the Super Thanks button below to donate. Every contribution helps us create even better stories for you. Join our community. Click the Join button to become a member for exclusive content and perks. We hope you'll join us again soon. Stay inspired, stay kind, and see you in the next video.